Good evening, everybody. I'm Ruth Reed from Green Planning Studio. I'm an architect with a fair bit of experience in planning. We're a planning-led practice, and Class Q is one of the areas in which we have specialism and experience. So I hope I'm going to be helpful tonight. I have to say it's probably not the most exciting topic you've ever met, but hopefully there'll be a few barns to look at as we go along. And I'm very happy to take questions at the end. I will warn you now, it's what they call complicated. Let's get going. So we're looking at the planning case tonight. So it's not the architectural case, it's what the requirements are in order to get planning under Class Q of the General Permitted Development Order, commonly known as the GDPO. That's where it is. If looking at legal documents is your thing, you will find also some of the clauses under Class W as well. If you're really interested, thankfully I have planners in the office who can dig into all of these things if we need them. So what you're applying for is a prior approval notice. It's not planning permission. The GDPO is about permitted development, and if something is permitted, it's deemed to have planning permission. So we apply for a notice to say one of three things. One, that prior approval isn't required, and we've met all of the requirements of the GDPO. Two, that prior approval is required, but it's been approved because everything needed has been submitted. And the one you don't want is prior approval is required and hasn't been granted. So why go for prior approval under Class Q rather than applying for planning permission? Well, the top line of this is that Class Q can establish the principle of dwelling in the countryside where there are few other planning routes. So what would your routes be if you were to go down the planning permission route? Well, you're largely constrained to what's known as paragraph 80 of the NPPF in England. It's even more constrained in Wales, but I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone. And this does allow dwellings in the countryside under a few limited rules. An essential rural worker, if you need to be close to a place of work in the countryside, and usually the local authorities restrict that to a fairly small dwelling. The best use of a heritage asset, and you might need to fall back on that because Class Q doesn't cover listed barns, or the reuse of a redundant or disused building. That's what you would apply for if you wanted planning permission. And they would still look quite closely about how far it is from services, but it would be, if you had to go down the planning permission route for your barn, that would be the one it would be under. You can subdivide an existing residential building, but clearly not what we're doing tonight. And the other one, of course, is the paragraph 80, design of exceptional quality, and that's your grand design, which again, sadly, we're not covering tonight, but it's fun if you do them. So what are the benefits? For Class Q, you can end up, as I said, a house in the countryside where there is no planning route. The second one actually isn't quite as good as it looks. The legislation has Class Q with an 8-week approval period, after which it's deemed approved. The problem with that is you go, great, you start work, and then they come along and say, it doesn't meet the legislation. They serve an enforcement notice on you. And because you started work, you can't go back and apply for Class Q. What we actually say is after 8 weeks, you then submit for a certificate of lawfulness to confirm that it complies with Class Q and that you can start work. It's a second application, it's more money, but it does mean that you are confirmed with a consent. Another advantage of Class Q, it's got over planning, is that planning has got an 8-week target approval period. We all know, either through bitter experience or from talk on the street, that actually it can take at least the 6 months non-determination period, frequently longer, and you will then have to apply again for release of the conditions before you can start work. So there's yet another planning application with delays beyond that. So it's a long process getting planning. Class Q can be very much quicker. You can get conditions on a Class Q, and I'll come to those later. They are fewer and very defined, but you won't end up with all the things that goes with the barn conversion under planning permission. You won't have to do ecology, a bat survey, and barn owls and goodness knows what, or landscaping, or any of the other excessive demands sometimes that are attached to planning permissions. So there's some things that apply to both. The Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL, which is applied to new residential floor areas, is applicable, but of course you do have the self-build exemption, which is an important benefit for self-build over any other route. The really important thing is that you get all of the necessary forms in at the right time. Otherwise, the councils can turn around at the end and say that you still owe it. But it is there. And in both routes, you will lose your permitted development rights. Under the Class Q rules, they go with versions of a bans that are almost always applied by the local authorities. So for a planning permission, that would be one of the conditions, that you didn't have any permitted development rights, and that would cover things like extensions and garages and sheds in the garden. Against Class Q, and it's not perfect, there are restrictions on the nature of the works and the extent of the curtilage, which is the land on which it stands, and I'll come to those. It has to be completed within 3 years. Now, planning permission, you have to start within 3 years. Completing in 3 years can be a challenge if you're struggling for builders and you do have a few conditions to release and things like that. So it does put you on a programme. Seems like a long time. Believe me, I've just finished our self-build and that took 17 months and that wasn't a barn conversion. So be aware that the clock starts ticking the day that prior approval notice comes out. And as I said before, the extent of the curtilage, you just get the ground print of the building and the building itself. So twice the ground print of the building. So it's not a large area. There's going to be an awful lot of words now, and I will try to distill it down. Really, it's here for people who want to read up on it afterwards. You'll probably be applying for a larger dwelling house. And on any site, in any farmyard, you can only have 3 of these with a maximum total floor area of 465 square metres. You can have up to 5 smaller dwelling houses, but none of them should exceed 100 square metres. So pretty much the same total build-out area. And that would possibly be if you were looking at doing a development with other people, but you will get small dwelling houses at 100 square metres. Then there's some rules about agricultural tenancies, and in a way, they're just there to protect agricultural tenants. You've got to have got their consent and the landlord's. Landlord's likely to be selling you the barn, so that's probably fine, but getting the consent of the tenant is important. And you can't get a Class Q if the tenancy was terminated within the year and you haven't had the agreement of the tenant. So the landowner trying to sell it can't just boot the tenant out and then expect you to get a Class Q. So when you're purchasing barn, you do need to be aware of these constraints. This is a tricky one. Class Q can't be applied where any works have been done to the barn under permitted development rights. And there are agricultural permitted development rights that include the right to change the sidings and the roof and the things like that. It's best to look for a barn that hasn't had any work done in 10 years. That's the safest route. That would ensure that you haven't fallen foul of that. We look as carefully as we can. Obviously, and unless there's dated photographic evidence, it's almost impossible to prove that work's been done within the last 10 years. But it is important to establish that as far as anybody can tell, that hasn't occurred, because Class Q would be denied. When we come to the building itself, we're looking at the constraints that exist on the external dimensions. You can't go any higher above the roof. So that excludes quite a number of roof lights available on the market. If you think about the conservation roof lights, they're the preferred ones. You can't do anything other than install or replace windows, doors, roofs, external walls. I'll come to that because that has had more rulings in the courts now, and obviously the services that are necessary. And you can do partial demolition necessary to do the building works, but not wholesale demolition. It all leads to this idea that you are converting a building that actually exists as a habitable space with improvements. There are places you can't do Class Q. You will see if you were sad enough to want to read the General Permitted Development Order, generally you would see Article 2.3 land mentioned quite a few times. Essentially, it's conservation areas, areas of outstanding natural beauty, which I understand are now going to be called national landscapes, areas protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Broads, and a national park, which this is in the picture, it's the Yorkshire Dales, and World Heritage Sites. The government floated the idea that they might extend Class Q to the national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. The Yorkshire Dales National Park, where this was taken, were absolutely up in arms immediately because you would literally destroy the special aspects of the Dales when you stuck an SUV outside and a fully glazed cart barn door on the front. There are places where barn conversions shouldn't happen, and this is an architect talking, that it doesn't work everywhere. And there's some fairly obvious ones, which you can see there. Sites of scientific interest, safety hazard areas, military. You might think these never happen, but they have occurred to us in our planning work where we found military explosive storage areas, and believe me, development doesn't take place there. And as I mentioned before, you can't do a Class Q on a listed building or a scheduled monument. Now, prior approval may be required for a number of things in which could be satisfied in the application or be the subject of conditions put on the issue of the notice. Highways, I mean, you've got to get access to the site and it's got to be safe. Noise, it may be either too noisy an environment or a residential use would cause a noise nuisance. It's more likely to be that the environment's too noisy if it's still in a current agricultural setting. Contamination, that can be from a number of sources, but slurry is one of them. And if it's been an active farmyard, you may have to demonstrate that there's no contamination. You wouldn't really want to do a barn conversion in a flood area. You certainly would struggle to lift it out of flood risk areas. So you need to check that that it isn't in a flood risk area before you proceed. And the location of the building, it really doesn't work to try to build in an active farmyard. It's just, as you can see, the cows are still there, and they don't make particularly good neighbours. They can ask for more information details on the external appearance of the building, which would bring it closer to the requirements for a planning permission. And following an issue of people doing very deep plan buildings without natural light into some rooms, they now require habitable rooms, which are living, dining and bedrooms, to have access to natural light. Well, that could be a roof light or a window. The thing that has happened in recent years is a court decision called Hibbett. And in it, the inspector's decision was challenged that suggested that, decreed that the barn wasn't so much being converted as rebuilt. And it was a steel frame barn, much as a lot of people are looking at now. The stone and brick ones seem to have all gone. And they had replaced all of the external walling and the roof, and it was deemed to be beyond that necessary to make the building habitable. It poses a challenge. It poses a challenge for us because we need to work out what's the minimum necessary to convert the building. And it does leave people with external materials that wouldn't be their first choice for their home. And I'll explain how we can take that on afterwards. So when you make a Class Q application, the principle for us that works is that we give the minimum amount of information. The more information you give to the local authority, the more they may be tempted to find reasons why it doesn't meet the regulations. We provide a planning statement that sets out clause by clause of the regulation. It's not like planning as we know it, where there's lots of flowery descriptions about aspect and prospect and materials. It actually just says how it meets the legislation. The basic elevations, floor plans, and site plan to show that it meets the regulations, and any supporting document necessary. For instance, if there's a question about flooding or noise, you would get the appropriate expert report if it was felt to be necessary. So what happens after approval? Well, you've got the 3 years. So with that clock ticking over your head, you could apply for a replacement dwelling. And this does have satisfactory outcomes for people. The important thing to remember is the time and the delays in the planning system. But it does allow you perhaps to have a dwelling with an orientation the way you wanted it, or to have to be of a better form or more appropriate to your needs. In the example on the screen, Barnes 1 and Barnes 3 had prior approval, or certificates saying they didn't need prior approval, so they could be converted. And the applicants are in the process of combining 1 and 3 and applying for a replacement dwelling for those 2. So they'll get a larger house out of it. And you can see there the curtilage associated with it. I would give you a strong warning on applying for additional curtilage. Local authorities don't like to convert agricultural land in the countryside into gardens, so it is tricky. And as I explained before, if the application ran out of time, confirm that it does comply with a certificate of lawfulness. I want to just talk briefly in the last 2 minutes about case study for Hornbeam Grange. This is a study of a building that was brought to us by Frame Technologies, and Simon's going to be talking to in a bit. And it had quite a sorry history. They had a Class Q approval for 3 dwellings, and a disaster happened with one of the barns. They started building at the end that hadn't got approval, and the local authority pointed that out to them. So they applied for the bit they were working on, but it was refused because they'd already started work, and that was upheld at appeal. So they had to demolish the barn. So that was a tragedy. They tried again for Class Q, one with a mezzanine side and one without, one with just ground floor accommodation, and they were both refused. And at that point, they came to us, and we looked at that 2021 and 2022 application and decided that actually what had gone wrong is they just put too much in. There was too much there for the local authority to have a say about. So we've now gone in with ground floor accommodation only, with the external materials pretty much as existing. The reasons, by the way, for the refusal of the 21 and 22 applications was that it required too much rebuilding to be a conversion. So we've played it very, very safe with a straight bat, and this is how we did it. Minimum information on the application, avoiding issues that we've found elsewhere in Wiltshire, where they've counted the voids at first floor as floor area, which meant that with the other barn on the site, they would have gone over the total amount of barn. So we said, right, we'll just go in on the ground floor only. And as I said, keep the existing cladding materials and repair them only. So they are now going forward with a planning application. So they are going down the planning application route, but they now have the principle of the dwelling, which is a material consideration towards grant of planning application. And they're going for more windows to allow them to have a mezzanine with windows out, and to replace the cladding materials. So hopefully we can do all that as quickly as possible and get them on site with Frame Technologies and others as soon as possible. So hopefully, Harvey, I have managed to keep to time, and you'll be able to keep everything flowing.
Average, that was perfection. Thank you very much. Thank you. In fact, there have been a few questions coming through.
Okay.
Of which a few of them I'll save for later, but there is one that came through from Julian. You mentioned that you've got 3 years and it's a strict 3-year window. Julian's just asking, what happens if you don't complete the build within that 3 years? Is there a risk that you would receive a fine? What would happen in that case?
You have lost your consent. And yes, the best thing that you could do would be to make a semi-retrospective planning application for the works that you've done. It is brutal.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I'm gonna pitch one more to you. So this came through fairly early whilst you were doing your presentation, Ruth. Does the integrity or the strength of the existing structure of the farm building impact on the building qualifying for Class Q consent?
Usually, particularly with the frame buildings, the intention is to build an inner structure holding the insulation and holding the roof insulation, because you can't take the roof off and build it higher. You literally build an inner skin with all of your insulation in, and then if the building itself is perfectly okay to remain standing as it is, then it doesn't need to carry any more additional weight. Interesting things happen with brick and stone barns where the integrity of the wall is under some question, and you would need a structural engineer to confirm that. But we are mainly looking at frame barns these days.
Brilliant. Ruth, thank you so much.
No problem.
Excellent introduction into the next couple of hours, so really appreciate that, and we shall see you again about 8:30, so in about an hour for the Q&A. So thank you, Ruth. I'm now going to ask Tom McSherry to join us. So Tom is from Buildstore. Buildstore you're probably very familiar with. They're the market leaders in the provision of self-build finance.